You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Laughlin.
Good morning and welcome to the show, everybody. On a Saturday morning, your host, Michael. Going to be joined here in a moment by Dr. Gaven Kerr and Pat Flynn. We're going to be talking about Thomistic Cosmological reasoning for God, the Ente argument, the Ente and Essentia, and possibly the first way. We'll see how it goes on how much time we have. And of course, y'all have seen these two gentlemen on the show before, but Dr. Gaven Kerr is professor at, or a lecturer in philosophy at Pontifical University, St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. And of course, Pat Flynn from the Pat Flynn Show, also associated with Word on Fire, doing all kinds of great stuff. So glad to have him back on as well. So once again, going to be doing the De Ente and Essentia topic coming up next. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. How are y'all?
Oh, I'm doing well, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us on again.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
And I was telling you backstage, I love the Mario painting. And I want to get me a copy now. So.
Very theologically appropriate, isn't it?
But I don't know what's next to Mario. That's the only thing I'm trying
I think
to
it's a
figure out.
cop like, hey, what is this mushroom you have here type of situation going on, right?
Okay. I love it. And Dr. Kerr, how are you over there? You're in Ireland, right?
Yeah, I'm in Ireland. So yeah, we're all doing good over here. It's getting into Saturday evening time over here. So when I'm done with this, I get to relax, and stick on Netflix and, settle down for my Saturday evening.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, and we were talking about beards backstage. Well, y'all, I just trimmed my beard, so both of y'all have me outdone right now.
Oh, please. No, I was concerned because Gavin can actually grow a beard. I at best can give the impression of having some like ferret stapled to my face.
Yeah.
So I was going to clean up before this conversation for fear that Gavin would, of course, have his beard on full display and cause me to look prepubescent, and those fears have been confirmed. So thank you, Gavin.
But see, Michael, you've got tattoos as well. That counts for something, Yeah. Pat himself doesn't have a single tattoo. When he comes to Ireland next year, I'm going to try and encourage him to come out and get tattoos with me.
The full sleeve, yeah.
That would be epic. Well, again, gentlemen, I'm glad to have y'all on. We had a great discussion last time, and I really look forward to this one. I really just kind of want to give y'all the floor. Take it wherever you want to go. Whoever wants to go first, have at it.
Yeah, well, let me just say a few things. I think that this will be a nice complement to our previous discussion. We spent a lot of time examining classical theism, defending it against a bunch of objections, but I think it's important to realize that classical theism is sort of like, it's the capstone, right, of the great metaphysical project. It's sort of the arrival point. So this conversation, I think, will be important because it's asking, well, how do we get there, right? Like what's motivating that? So yeah, I think that that's equally important because I would argue when you really start to carve reality at its joints, I've said it before and it's a little provocative to me. It just seems like classical theism or bust at the end of the day. So hopefully we'll get the opportunity to give some of those motivations in this conversation. So yeah, good to be here. Looking forward to it. Gavin, any opening remarks?
No. It's just what you say that classical theism, it comes as, the capstone to working out a systematic metaphysics, to considering the nature of being and trying to figure out what it is to be. So it's not doing, philosophy of religion as if it were a subject area. It's doing metaphysics, and then issues pertaining to God come up in metaphysics. So we don't start metaphysics with any sort of demonstration of God. We end metaphysics with the demonstration of God. So it's part and parcel of having a systematic philosophical worldview.
Right. Yeah. One more remark. I think this will be an interesting conversation. I'll see. I'm curious to see where it will go because Gavin, in fact, because he's not always as great as he could be about promoting his own work. He's got this wonderful little book here called Aquinas's Way to God. It's a book-length treatment of the De Ente. he's the expert in that stuff. Where I think I come in and I complement, as I've done a number of like contemporary formulations of cosmological arguments that really just draw from de Ente reasoning, Aquinas's insights. And I think that those formulations have interesting or unique advantages to some of the things that crop up in the philosophy of religion literature. So I might just insert some of that here and there as we move forward. But otherwise, I think maybe we should just have Gaven open it up with maybe a presentation of the de Ente, unless you had something else in mind, Gaven.
No, that sounds good. Nice to see a copy of my book being held up. I don't have a copy of it here with me, except I'm on my laptop and it's on my laptop, the manuscript. So if I need to refer to it, it's at least there. But yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We could just bounce into the de Ente, and see where we go from there.
Yeah.
Happy with that, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. Sure.
Okay, so I suppose I'll give us sort of a brief start and a rundown, and we'll just kind of stop and start as we go along to discuss the argument as it comes up. So the De Ente et Essentia, historically it was written by Thomas when he would have been in his early 30s, and it was written as a textbook for his brother Dominicans at St. Jacques in Paris. Thomas would have been a doctoral student, more or less, and these younger Dominicans, they would have been studying metaphysics, and they didn't understand metaphysics, so they went to brother Thomas and asked, could he give them a wee bit of a précis of metaphysics. And so he wrote the De Ente et Essentia, one of his earliest works. And in it, in chapter 4, he does two things. He outlines what's known as the distinction between essence and existence in things, or the distinction between essence and esse. Esse just being the act of existence. And in doing that, he goes on to offer a demonstration of God's existence, so that whereas everything is a composite of essence and existence, so they're existing essences, in essence, with a distinct act of existence, none of those things would have the act of existence that they have unless there was something which is pure existence in which they participated for their existence. So that's what the outlook in the De Ente et Essentia gives us in chapter 4. And that's kind of just, broad strokes what's going on there. So the best way into this sort of stuff is to consider the distinction between essence and existence and the argumentation that Thomas offers for that in chapter 4. So should we get into that? Happy enough with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. Right. So in chapter 4, what Thomas has been considering up to now is the nature of essence as it's found in material things. So the nature of essence as it's found in material things is that it's a composite of matter and form. In chapter 4, he considers, matter is the principle of potency and form is a principle of actuality. So form actualizes the potency of matter to be such and such a thing. Thomas asks, what about immaterial substances? If they exist, how could they be in potency? So we don't need to be committed to the existence of immaterial substances, but just like they consider it hypothetically, if they did exist, how would they be in potency? So the underlying metaphysical question here is, whilst matter is a principle of potency, is it the principle of potency, such that if immaterial things existed, would they have no potency whatsoever? And Thomas points out that, there was this view, it originated in the Jewish thinker Avesbraun or even Gabriel, and it was to the effect that immaterial things have some kind of matter to them so that they may have potency. And it was argued that they have what's called incorporeal matter. So they're material, they just don't have corporeal matter. Whereas the physical things that we see around us, they have corporeal matter. And this was a view that was found in Ibn Gabriel, it's found in a few other authors, and it's known as universal hylomorphism. So hylomorphism just means matter-form composition. Universal hylomorphism means then that everything which is in potency in some way is a composite of matter and form. So that accounts for, the potency of things. It makes matter the principle of potency and form the principle of actuality. So there's no more fundamental principle of potency than matter and no more fundamental principle of actuality than form. Now, Thomas disagrees with this position. He rejects it. He thinks, it's somewhat ad hoc just to, say, immaterial things, how do we explain their potency? Well, yeah, they're material, but they're just not the usual sort of materiality that we see around us. He thinks, immaterial things are immaterial precisely because they're completely separated from matter and all material conditions. So if there were such things, we need to give an account of their potency without this sort of ad hocery, incorporeal matter. So Thomas, says, look, we need to think this through properly from the beginning. And he holds that whilst immaterial substances, if they exist, are not pure act, they have an element of potentiality to them, and that's the potentiality for existence. So what Thomas then has to do is show that in things there is a distinction between essence and existence, such that the essence stands in potency to existence. So whilst the essence of the thing could be material or immaterial, depending on what kind of thing you have, that essence itself, material or immaterial, stands in potency to the act of existence. So he needs to establish this distinction between essence and existence, and that's where we get to now with the argumentation. How does that sound for starters? Are we good with that?
Yeah,
Anything
and by the
else?
way, I'm just kind of curious because I've I've heard some people say that Aquinas was the first to make this distinction, but then I've also heard others say that maybe Boethius or other figures have picked up on it. Just curious.
Yeah. It's sort of alluded to, thought about, in the history of philosophy. Aristotle distinguishes between what a thing is and that a thing is. Boethius distinguishes between id quod est, that which is, and id quo est, that whereby it is. And then Avicenna famously distinguishes between essence and existence because, he considers essence as it is in the thing, as it is in the intellect, and as it is in itself. So essence in itself is neutral with regard to existence, and then existence is an added accident to it. Just to kind of point out with that, Aquinas is the first to give this sort of robust presentation to the distinction. He disagrees with Avicenna that existence is an accident of essence, because that's, conceives of essence in what's called a thick sort of sense, as having some sort of ontological reality prior to having existence. For Thomas, that's absurd. Nothing has any ontological reality without existence. With Boethius, he reads Boethius very charitably, the way he usually does with the history of philosophy, and says that, that distinction between id quod est and id quo est, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So when he's commenting on Boethius's De Abdomatibus, he points at, he says, this is kind of what I'm getting at with this distinction between essence and existence, participation. Whether the historical Boethius believed that is a different matter. Aristotle, he's keen to attribute his own position to Aristotle, but the problem there is Aristotle distinguishes between what a thing is and that a thing is. The existence there, which is contained in the thatness, is just the fact of a thing's existence, the fact that it obtains. It doesn't, for the historical Aristotle, signify any ontological principle in the thing by which it obtains other than the form of the thing. So Thomas is really the first in the history of philosophy, so far as I'm aware, to have this really robust metaphysical sense of existence. Pat, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I'll just ask you this question, Gavin. How do you feel about the term restrictedness or limitation to kind of as a catch-all when we're talking about essences, right? Because I think sometimes just you explained that really well, right, in the historical context. But with certain notions that people have of materiality these days, right? And in the way that I presented some of these arguments, I've certainly found it helpful to think of anything that has a set of qualitative limits, boundedness, restrictedness, right? This would apply equally to material beings like us, but also angels or something like that, because even though they're not material in our sense, they still are restricted, right? In their powers and their knowledge and stuff like that. So I'd just be curious to see how flexible you would be with using some of these other terms in presenting de Ente reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds all right to me. I mean, the essence is a principle of restriction or limitation for the act of existence. So, my act of existence is limited to me as an individual human being. It's my act of existence. So the essence as a distinct receiving principle limits the act of existence. Sounds fine to me. So long as we grant that essence is, a positive ontological feature of a thing.
For sure, right? But it's always going to, as we'll argue, right? It's always going to have to be, whatever an act of existence is, it's going to have to be distinct from a set of limits, right? If we identify it with a set of limits, then that would restrict everything to existing in that way, right? Yeah. And then we wouldn't be able to have multiplicity. But since we do have multiplicity, we can say whatever existence is, right? It has to explode these limits, any restrictions whatsoever, and then that's when we're going to get to the unbounded, right?
That's it, exactly. And I mean, that anticipates an important point, that an act of existence which isn't received in a distinct essence is unlimited.
And that's God.
So, yeah, exactly. Unreceived act is unlimited. Yeah. So and that's what God is, because God is an act of existence not received in a distinct essence.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry if that took us a little bit sideways, but I just wanted to throw that out there for just for fun, if nothing else. But continue. Yeah.
Okay, cool. You happy enough for me to go on, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dead on. Cheers. Right. So Thomas needs to give some reasons for thinking that essence and existence are distinct. I mean, we look out in the world and we think, well, okay, yeah, I mean, that seems plausible that, things come in and out of existence. And so existence seems to be something distinct from things. But Thomas needs some sort of robust argumentation, to include that in his metaphysics. So he begins, there's kind of a 3-stage approach of argumentation here. He starts with an argument, what it's been called is the Intellectus Essentiae argument, because it's based on the understanding of essence. And then he moves on from that to what's been labeled the Impossibility of Multiplication argument. And then in a 3rd stage, he offers the demonstration for God's existence. Now, all Thomists agree that Thomas seeks to offer argument for a real distinction between essence and existence. That is, that the two are distinct in real things, but we disagree as to what stage that happens. So, for example, Ed Fieser, Anthony Kenny, Stephen Long think that the distinction is made in the 1st stage of argument. Myself and John Whipple, we think it's in the 2nd stage. Joseph Owens thinks it's in the 3rd stage. Now, we all agree that at some point it happens, but we just disagree as to where. So that's kind of an inter-Thomist sort of debate which is going on there. So that 1st stage, the Intellectus Essentiae stage, what Thomas argues is whatever doesn't enter into the understanding of an essence or quiddity is distinct from the essence or quiddity and composed with it from without. This is because to understand a thing's essence, one needs to understand the parts of that essence. So if I'm understanding the essence of something, I understand its parts, okay? Now, in understanding the essence of anything, I don't understand its existence. So I can understand what a thing is without knowing its existence. And Thomas gives the example of a phoenix and a man. You can understand the nature of a phoenix and you can understand the nature of a man without phoenixes existing and without men existing. You can understand what they are. That then goes to show that existence then isn't a part of any essence, in which case existence is distinct from essence. And that's the Intellectus Essentiae stage. And he just finishes it with the line, unless there's something whose essence is its existence. So that's the 1st stage. And as I say, Fieser, Kenny, Long, they all hold it. That delivers as a real distinction between essence and existence.
Right. And I'll chime in here with what I think is probably one of the more common objections at this point, and I'll get your thoughts on it, Gavin. But I'll borrow from where does Oderberg fall in this? Does he think the first it's established at the beginning?
I haven't really followed Oderberg on this issue. Doesn't he follow that argument from Fieser?
Yeah. I think he does. So yeah, let me state it. So the objection would be this: like, is this question begging, right? Because doesn't it assume that we have like a complete understanding of a thing's essence? And like, I think there's actually something to that objection that invites interesting questions for Thomistic epistemology. Let's put that aside, right? Because I think that we can offer some replies here. And actually, these come from like Oderberg and Fieser. This is how they typically deal with it, right? So first is to notice there's something about the idea of misconception that I think we have to understand, right? So say that we think of a lion, right? Whatever else a lion is, and we think that a lion is a type of reptile. Well, now we've really misconceived what the nature or essence of a lion is. But it doesn't seem like that's the case if we were to say that lions don't exist. Like, we've got something factually wrong, but it doesn't seem like we've misconceived something essential about a lion. So it seems like there's a relevant difference here, right? So to say that, no lions exist is to get something factually wrong, but not essentially wrong, and therefore not to misconceive what a lion is, shows that there's a distinction here, right? That's the suggestion. I think it's a good one. So even, and what the suggestion is really getting at is that even if we knew kind of like all there is about a lion down to its last essential detail, we would know that a lion isn't a reptile, but we wouldn't know whether or not a lion exists. So having an incomplete grasp of something's essence, which is the case for many, if not most things of our experience, doesn't mean that we don't know enough to see that there's a real distinction between the essence and existence of a thing. Otherwise, to say lions don't exist would be to misconceive, right? And one more point here is that once we know that a lion is a reptile, it's not a reptile, right? Once we know that it's not a reptile, we'll know something about any lion that has existed, currently exists, or will exist in the future. However, even if we know that some lion exists currently, we can't extrapolate that, right? We don't know if lions have always existed, and presumably they haven't, right? Or if they'll always exist in the future, and presumably they could go extinct. So I think that's another indicator there in support of that first that first stage of this argument for the real distinction. Gaven, any further thoughts on that objection or the responses?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been thinking about that a bit, because when Feezer reviewed my book in the Thomist, and he kind of mentioned that he disagreed with me on that stage of the argument. He liked the book, but he disagreed with that bit. And I've seen him run that argument before, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit. And people have put it to me, and I suppose my response has always been that that argument there presupposes that we're thinking about things, we're thinking about the essences of things, so that we're dealing with what's traditionally been called first intentions. Whereas the argument in the De Ente, the Intellectus Essentia argument in the De Ente, Thomas isn't thinking about things, he's thinking about our concepts of things and how we think about concepts. So he doesn't have actual things directly in his sight, it's our concepts of things and how we understand those concepts. So he's dealing with second intentions there. So he's engaged in, epistemology, psychology, cognitional theory. He's not engaged, with objects. So my thoughts on that is that whilst that's an interesting argument, that Feezer and others make, it's not the actual Intellectus Essentiae argument.
It's not Aquinas' argument. Is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's not the actual argument that he's making there. And that's fine. Feezer can, advance arguments, and there's something good to them. And I think there's something in that argument, that there is an important distinction between understanding and judgment. Mm-hmm. They can tell us something about the world that is so structured so as to be known by means of understanding and judgment. The historical point would just be that's not the Intellectus Essentiae argument. That's a different argument.
Right. Yeah. And that is an important point, right? Is because I know for a lot of your work, Gaven, it's not just do these arguments work, but is this what Aquinas intended, right? Mm-hmm. So, right. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this part because there's a lot more to discuss. But here we could say, actually, yeah, I think those arguments do work, but this isn't how Aquinas was thinking at the time. Is that fair putting it?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, those arguments work and they're great, and we can engage with them. Contemporary philosophy, we're doing that. We just have to be careful that we don't attribute what are our own arguments to Aquinas as if they were his arguments.
Yeah, fair enough. One more thing, I guess, is it cool if we just kind of address objections as we go along that people might hear? Well, Gaven, here's another objection, right? If essence and existence were really distinct, and if you want to hold on to this till later, let me know. Then shouldn't we be able to have one without another? Shouldn't there be some couldn't we have separability, right? If there's a real distinction, does real distinction entail separability? What would you say to that?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So separability, is a kind of distinction. Definitely the moon and the sun are distinct from each other, non-identical to each other, but that's not the only kind of real distinction that you can have. You can have real distinction between matter and form, real distinction between body and soul, real distinction between form and function. So whilst they're really distinct because they're non-identical with each other, they're united in the thing. So the matter and the form of the statue, so that the marble of the statue is not identical to the form or the shape of the statue. Okay, so they are, really distinct from each other, but they're inseparable from each other. They're united as act and potency. Another example is the heart and the heartbeat, or the eye and sight. They're not identical to each other, but they're inseparable from each other. Mm-hmm. So there are kinds of, real distinctions which don't involve separation.
Real separability, right.
Yeah. And the problem was after Aquinas' death, one of his followers, Giles of Rome, adopted a real distinction where he distinguished between essence and existence as a distinction between res and res, as a distinction between two things. And it was the Franciscans, Scotus and Occam, and all those who attacked Thomas on the real distinction were attacking the position of Giles of Rome, where essence and existence are two distinct things. And they attacked it with a really, sort of plausible, argument. Look, if essence is a thing with some sort of ontological reality to it, independently of existence, then what do we need existence for? If essence already is without existence, we don't need a distinct act of existence. And so, job done. They rejected the Thomists, but they were really rejecting Giles. Thomas's position was much more subtle than that. Right. This isn't a distinction of two separate things.
Yeah, Gila Klima, if I'm pronouncing that right, he gives a good independent example. And he'll remind us that it's clear that the triangularity of any particular triangle is not the same thing as trilaterality, right? Yeah. But however, we can't have a particular triangularity without ever having a particular trilaterality, right? So they're really distinct, right? We know that, right? There's a difference between having three angles and having three sides. But in reality, you're never going to have one without the other, right?
Yeah.
I think that's just nice to have those other examples where we have a clear, real distinction without separability, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Will we go on?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first stage. The second stage of argumentation then is what's known as the impossibility of multiplication stage. So those who think a real distinction is established in the first stage, they see it to be universalized then in this second stage. It's applicable to everything but one possible being. Okay. So anything which is basically anything which is multipliable is subject to distinction of essence and existence. And, for Feezer and the like, already shown to be real in the first stage. For the likes of myself and Whipple, we hold that the first stage of argumentation, what Thomas is distinguishing is how we think about things, not, features of the things itself. And so it's in the second stage that the reality of the distinction is shown in the things themselves. So that's just the different interpretive moves, but the argumentation is the same on both counts. So what Thomas does is he said he ended the intellectus essentiae argument with that phrase, unless there's something whose essence is its existence. Now let's just consider that. Consider the hypothesis. We don't know if that exists yet. That's going to be, what stage 3 brings up. So let's just consider the hypothesis of something whose essence is its existence. What would that be like if there were such a thing? Well, Thomas holds that it would be subsistent existence. Its essence would be existence itself, so it would be subsistent existence itself. And as such, it couldn't be multiplied in any way. There's no way in which it could be multiple. And to demonstrate why this is so, he considers he lays out three kinds of multiplication, and he considers and rejects the first two. So the three types of multiplication that you have is, as a genus is multiplied into a species by the addition of some differentiating feature, the way animal is multiplied into human beings, cats, dogs, by the addition of differentiating features such as rationality, felininity, canininity, and so forth. So some principle independent of the genus serves to specify the genus. The second form of multiplication is as a species is multiplied into individuals. So the species human is multiplied in individual humans through the addition, again, of some other principle, matter in this case. So the species human is received in distinct chunks of matter. And then the third form of multiplication is when you have something separate and absolute in which things participate for whatever reality that it is. So if you had some separated source of heat or light, things would just come to participate in the heat or light of that separated source. Now, Thomas considers the first two and rejects the first two. He doesn't consider the third. And it's pretty obvious why he doesn't consider the third, because in the third case, what's separate and absolute isn't actually being multiplied. You already have multiple things which are sharing in the reality of that which is separate and absolute, but it doesn't lose its, unity in being shared in. So the light of the sun is shared in by all the things on the earth, but that doesn't mean you have so many suns for everything that comes to enjoy the light of the sun. So Thomas, he doesn't consider that third one because it's not really a threat to the position he's going to defend. But in considering the first two, he holds that something whose essence is its existence couldn't be multiplied in either of those two ways. So as a genus into species and a species into individuals. The reason why it can't be multiplied the way a genus is multiplied is because the genus is multiplied through the addition of, some principle distinct from the genus, which multiplies it, the differentiating feature. So you add rationality to animality, you get rational animals. Well, this hypothetical being is pure existence itself. Outside of it, there is nothing. So there is nothing outside of it which could be added to it to multiply it. The differentiating feature is always outside the genus, and it multiplies it. But this, hypothetical being is pure existence itself, outside of which there is nothing. So there's nothing which could be added to it to multiply it. So that's how he rejects the first form of multiplication. The second form of multiplication is rejected in a similar manner, but with a twist. The second one then is that the species is received in a distinct chunk of matter. Again, something whose essence is its existence couldn't be received in a distinct chunk of matter because there's nothing outside of it to which it is subject. But not only that, let's say even if per impossibile it were received in a distinct chunk of matter, then it would no longer be subsistent existence itself. It would subsist in its matter. So material things subsist in their matter. So I subsist as long as my matter hangs together. My matter hangs together because of my form. Once my matter starts to decompose and once, it stops hanging together, I'm dead. That's that. So I only subsist in the matter that I have, and that's a feature of material things. But because this hypothetical being is pure existence itself, it subsists in itself and not in any principle distinct from it. It couldn't be received in matter, so it couldn't be multiplied in a material way. So Thomas, he considers those first two modes of multiplication, and he rejects them for this hypothetical being. Now, the question is, well, has he been exhaustive enough? Surely there are other forms of multiplication he could have considered, or what if there are other forms of multiplication? One of the arguments that I made in my book was that Thomas's point here is it's more a priori that if you have something which is pure existence itself, there is nothing distinct from it to which it could be subject, which would multiply it. So in order to multiply something, you need some sort of principle of multiplication. So if something which was pure existence itself, okay, were to be multiplied, we need to find some distinct principle of multiplication by which to multiply it. But since it just is pure existence, there's nothing distinct from it to which it stands as subject. Anything other than it is dependent on it for its existence. So there is in principle nothing which can multiply pure existence itself. So it's utterly unique. Okay, it's one and utterly unique. Now, one thing to point out here is that if Thomas can show that there in fact exists something whose essence is its existence, then he's already demonstrated that it's one and unique and immaterial. So if he can show then, which he's going to do in the next stage, that such a thing exists, you have a single, unique, immaterial source of existence of all else. Mm-hmm. So, we're pretty well on our way there, with the whole, classical theism end of things. But, I mean, that reasoning was quite involved. That's all for the sake, on my reading, of establishing real distinction of essence and existence. And this is how he does it.
Yeah, it's and that's because we have a multiplicity of things. Like, they can't be that thing, right? That's the punchline there, right? It's like, because this thing can't be multiplied, since we have multiple instances of things, anything which could in principle be multiplied or is in fact multiplied obviously isn't that which exists in virtue of itself, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I love this. I think this is brilliant, and this is something I've played around with a lot in sort of my own writings and formulations here. And yeah, let me just try and give a summary or a different way of thinking about this. Is like, so I actually, in my formulations of I guess, cosmological arguments, I kind of reversed the ordering. Like, I first showed that there has to be at least one thing that exists in virtue of itself instead of in virtue of something else, right? Because, if everything in reality, even collectively, were a dependent reality or conditioned or caused reality, then everything would collectively be awaiting the fulfillment of conditions beyond itself in order to exist. It would be awaiting causation. But beyond reality in total, definitionally is nothing, right? So like those conditions could never be fulfilled, which means we'd get a contradiction of fact. Like, nothing would exist if everything in reality, even collectively, were conditioned or caused or contingent, or really what we're saying, if everything in reality were just that which has a real distinction between its essence and existence, nothing would exist, right? We'd get this contradiction of fact. And then just through disjunctive reasoning, we can see, well, okay, the only way around that is that if it's not A, it has to be not A. So not everything can be conditioned or contingent. Not everything can be that which has a real distinction between its essence and existence. So there has to be that one thing, right? And then we can ask, well, what is that one thing? And this is where the de Ente reasoning comes in. So say that there's this, that there has to be like this, call it an unconditioned reality, that which exists in virtue of itself, right? Well, as Gaven was saying, it has to be a pure act of existence existing through itself. And the word pure is really important. And Gaven gave the sort of the traditional way of working through this, but I think we can kind of summarize it quickly as follows, right? So if it weren't a pure act of existence existing through itself, whatever this reality is, right, then there would be a part of it, a feature, an aspect, a dimension within it that was different from the act of existing through itself, right? It would be different from that. But if there's a part of this reality or dimension, a feature, an aspect that was different from an act of existence existing through itself, then it just wouldn't be an unconditioned or uncaused or necessary reality, right? It would have to be activated, or it'd be conditioned upon something beyond itself, right? So we get a contradiction then, right? Because then we'd be saying we have a reality that has to be uncaused and yet stands in a dependency relation or is conditioned or caused by something else, right? So that can't be the case. So whatever else is sort of necessary, fundamental, non-contingent, unconditioned reality is, it has to be a pure act of existence existing through itself, right? So If it weren't active, if it weren't actual, it would have to be activated, which means it would be in need of a cause, which is contradictory since we've already affirmed that it has to be uncaused. And if it existed in virtue of something else or any part of it did, then again, we would have the same contradiction that it's both unconditioned and conditioned. So the point is, like, you're not going to get any differentiating features in this reality. It has to be a pure active existence existing through itself. And this is huge for classical theism. Now, why is it huge for classical theism? Because classical theism says that God is absolutely simple, right? Well, complexity entails parts. That's true by definition. Parts require differentiating features, right? One way of telling one part apart from another part, apart from the whole, we've just argued that whatever else this reality is, it's not susceptible to differentiating features. Therefore, it has no parts. Therefore, it has to be absolutely ontologically simple. Right. So I just wanted to draw the connection there of how you not only secure God's uniqueness, so we get an in principle monotheism from this reasoning, we also secure divine simplicity as well. So, yeah.
Can you just explain one more time, why could it not have differentiating features? Right.
So say that there has to be at least one uncaused or unconditioned reality in the totality of reality. And I can build out that previous argument if you want me to. More, but Gavin's actually going to argue for it here soon anyways. Okay. But let's just say that that's keep it hypothetical now, right? That there's an unconditioned reality, some reality that doesn't stand in need of an extrinsic cause or explanation, right? Mm-hmm. It has to be a pure active existence, existing through itself. Because if there were any part or feature or dimension within that reality that was different from the active of existence existing through itself, then it wouldn't be that, right? This is just definitionally true, which means it would have to be activated or caused or conditioned upon something else, which means it's not an active existence existing through itself, right? So there's no way we can get differentiating features into this reality. And without
because you're saying there has to be something that would put it into composition, I guess, is what you're saying?
Right. So consider the hypothetical that Gavin was entertaining, right? I'm using the term unconditioned reality. So there's some just kind of terminological shifts here, but think of just a reality that exists through itself and not through something else, right? Right. That whose essence just is existence. Like it's built-in engine of existence, if you will, right? It's not powered by anything else. It's I'm okay using the term self-explanatory. I know some philosophers aren't, but I think that's actually okay when we're talking about God, right? So it's an unconditioned reality. It stands in no dependency relation to anything else. Nothing brought it into existence. Nothing keeps it into existence. We'll just keep that hypothetical. So let's imagine that this thing is there. Like, what would this thing be? Well, what Gavin argued in the more traditional terms, I'm just kind of arguing in a more general sense that it has to be a pure act of existence existing through itself, right? Because if an unconditioned reality were not a pure act of existence existing through itself, then there would be a part, right? A feature, a dimension, an aspect, whatever you want to call a part within this reality that was different from the act of existence existing through itself, right? However, if that part within this reality was different from the act of existence existing through itself, right? Then then we have a contradiction, because now we're just saying that if it's different from an act of existing through itself, then it has to be activated by something else, right? So we've just said that this reality is uncaused, but now we're saying that it is caused, right? You see the contradiction? It's both uncaused and caused if we try to put a part in it or any differentiating feature that is different from that which exists through itself. And Gavin gave the more kind of like specific technical ways you might try and multiply something out, but I think we can keep it much more general. And then if you think contradiction are impossible, which you should, because contradictions are impossible, right? They're impossible states of affairs. Then you have to say, okay, whatever else this thing is, it's a pure act of existence existing through itself, right? To avoid that contradiction of positing both an unconditioned conditioned reality or an uncaused caused reality. And once you grant that, you get simplicity, because complexity it entails parts. That's true by definition. Parts require differentiating features, one way of telling one part apart from another part or the whole. We've just argued this reality is not susceptible to differentiating features, right? And so it can't have any parts, right? It has to be absolutely ontologically simple. So I don't know if that just added confusion to the way that Gavin came at it, but I try to think of it in the broadest way possible to show that whatever else this reality is, we'll just keep it a hypothetical reality now, that if it existed, it would have to be a pure act of existence existing through yourself. Gavin, what do you make of that? Is there any clarifications you want to make to that formulation?
Yeah, it sounds grand to me. So, I mean, I defend the view in the more traditional way that if it's pure existence itself, it's pure actuality. So, if it had any components, then those components would have to be actualized in some way. And if those components have to be actualized in some way, then it's not pure existence. It's a composite of act and potency. So it's not something whose essence is its existence.
And why would components have to be actualized? Why couldn't they already be in act? That, I guess, would be the question.
Well, those components would have to exist. And so those components would have an active existence in order to exist. Otherwise, they don't exist. So if this being had these components, then they would be existing components. And if this being is pure existence itself, but it has these components have to be actualized in some way in it. So they have to stand in potency to some sort of, active existence. So it becomes a composite of essence and existence again.
Right. Or but let's think about it this way, right? So let's just say that there has to be one unconditioned or uncaused reality, right? Here's another reason why the component theory won't work, right? In the sense that if it's an uncaused reality in some part we're not active or actual, then it would need to be activated, right? Which makes no sense because we just said this reality is uncaused, right? So whatever else that thing is, it isn't actually part of the reality. It's an effect of it. That's what you're saying, right? When you just posited this potential part, either this potential part could be actualized or it couldn't be actualized, right? If it could be actualized, then it's an effect of this thing. It's not a part of it, right? Maybe it's its first effect, but it's not a part of it. Or somebody might try and do something trickier and say, well, maybe it's just a potential in this thing that couldn't be actualized. For whatever reason, it can't muster the power to actualize this potential, right? And then that's not going to work because a potential that could never in principle be actualized by the most fundamental reality, you're talking about nothing, right? A potential is something that at least could in principle be actualized, right? So now you've just posited literally nothing. So there's no middle position here is what Gaven and I are arguing, right? If you're trying to put a potency in here, you're either confusing that for a part with an effect, or you're not talking about anything at all at the end of the day. And you can argue that from this reality as a hypothetical mode, or you can first argue that there has to be at least one uncaused or unconditioned reality, which is my traditional path, and then argue that it has to be a pure active existence existing through itself.
So this part would necessarily have to have some element of potency, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's going to require a differentiating feature, right? And we've already argued in order to call it a part, right? There's going to be some way of having to tell it apart, right, from other parts of the whole. And given the de Ente reasoning, we've already argued this reality cannot have any differentiating features whatsoever. So that's automatically going to exclude the possibility of parts. So you can come at it from that way as well. So you can kind of reach the same conclusion from different angles. Some I think are a little more initially obvious than others.
Yeah. I was just asking because I had RT Mullins on I want to say maybe a week or so ago. And that was something I noticed about him is that he denied simplicity. So I was just, trying to get some responses there. Okay. Sorry to derail that.
No, that's a really good one. I think that I'm glad you did, Michael, because this is showing, I think, the security, and we've argued this in the previous podcast, is that this reasoning is kind of a package deal with simplicity and a robust monotheism, right? If you want to secure an in principle monotheism, not just there just happens to be one God, but there in principle can only be one God. This metaphysics does that, right? It secures a robust monotheism. However, it also it comes with simplicity, right? So it's really a package deal there.
Yeah. Sorry,
cool. So
y'all can continue.
Yeah. So just to kind of reiterate, the way Gaven and the traditional de Ente reasoning approaches this is they first leave it just hypothetical of whether this reality could exist, and it's just entertaining. If this reality exists, what would it be like? And Gaven argued that it could only be one, right? It would be uniquely unique. I kind of maybe added some confusion because I said we can actually first argue that there must be one of these realities through other thought experiments, and then I unpack what it is. So I think that's actually cool that you could come at this either way, right? But let's go back to the way Gaven was doing it. Let's just still assume that it's just a hypothetical right now, and then given what we've been arguing for the real distinction, let's show how we can get from the hypothetical to the actual. Does that sound good, Gaven?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole point of that reasoning is to show distinction of essence and existence. And the point is that, well, look, given that it's a conceptual truth about this this thing, that it would have to be one and unique. Anything which isn't one and unique then isn't that. So anything which is multiple is not something whose essence is its existence. So if there are real multiple things, which there are, they're not things in which essence and existence are identical, in which case they're things in which essence and existence are distinct. And so it's at that stage that myself and Whipple, we hold that the real distinction has been established, whereas the likes of Fieser and Kenny and stuff, they hold that it's just been universalized to all things but one possible thing, which is this thing whose essence is its existence. It's not now until stage 3, the next stage, where Thomas goes on to demonstrate that such a being exists. So a single, unique, immaterial source of existence for all things then is what Thomas goes on to establish in this third stage. So that's where the exciting stuff happens. Shall we get into that?
Oh, yeah.
Great. So Thomas, I mean, for a doctoral student in his early 30s, Thomas is very, very, very strict with the way he puts this across. And the principles that he uses in this argument are principles that come up throughout his career. And I would argue in every one of his arguments for God's existence, he's deploying the same principles and same schematic way of reasoning. He starts by saying, look, things have certain characteristics or properties, either as a result of their intrinsic nature or as a result of some extrinsic principle. So take, for example, risability, the ability to laugh in man. That's man has that ability, man has that feature as a result of being a rational animal. It's because that a man is rational that he can get a joke and so laugh at it and have a sense of humor. So that's, a feature that something has as a result of its intrinsic principles. Things can have other features as a result of some extrinsic principle. And the example that Aquinas gives is that of the atmosphere being illuminated by the light of the sun. So the atmosphere isn't self-illuminating. It depends or it participates in the illumination granted to it by something else. Now, when it comes to essence and existence, they've already been shown to be distinct. So given that they're distinct, and we have something that has an active existence, does it have its active existence as a result of its intrinsic nature, i.e. its essence, or does it have existence as a result of some extrinsic principle? Well, it can't have existence as a result of its intrinsic nature, because we've already shown that existence is distinct from its intrinsic nature, i.e. from its essence. So it has to have existence as a result of some extrinsic principle. So there's some cause for the existence that a thing has. And then Thomas sets up the familiar causal regress. What about the cause of the existence of that and the existence of that, and so on. And then Thomas employs a principle that what is through another, or per aliud, is reducible to what is per se. So what exists through another, per aliud, is reducible to what exists per se, or in itself. Otherwise, we have an infinite regress of causes. Now, why would an infinite regress of causes be a bad thing? Thomas distinguishes between two kinds of causal series, a per accidens causal series and a per se ordered causal series. Best way to sort of tease out the difference between these two kinds of causal series is to go by examples that Thomas gives. So the typical example of a per accidens causal series is a series of fathers producing sons. Peter is the father of James, James is the father of John, so on, so on, so back and so back. Now take the causality of that series. What is the causal power in the series? It's fatherhood, begetting. Okay, so Peter begets James, James begets John. Now, interestingly, in that series, okay, each member of the series is responsible for the immediately succeeding member of the series. Peter is responsible for James, but Peter is not responsible for John, because Peter's not the father of John. It's not Peter that begets John, it's James that begets John. Not only that, James doesn't need Peter's help to beget John. Okay, so a son doesn't need his father's help to have his own son. That just doesn't happen. Or if it does, that's scandalous. Okay, so the earlier members of the series are not required in order for later members of the series to continue. So Peter could have his son James go out and die. James could grow up and father his own son, John, making Peter a grandfather, but Peter doesn't exist now. So Peter is not the cause of the grandson, John. It is James who is the cause, the father of his own son, Peter's grandson. And what that indicates then is that in an accidentally ordered series, the members of the series have the causality, the causal power of that series, essentially in virtue of what they are. Okay, they don't have it distinct from themselves. They have it in virtue of what they are. So the series continues as long as there's members of the series. So as long as you have an immediately succeeding member of every member of the series, you don't need a first. You don't need a first cause in that series. That could be that can be a beginningless series, and Aquinas was well aware of that. It's potentially infinite, but it's actually finite, because at any one moment in the series, you have, just a father and a son. So you have the father produces a son, the father dies, he produces a son, he dies, he produces a son, he dies, and so on and so on. Given the succession of the series, it could just go on and on and on, and it doesn't need a beginning and it doesn't need an end. By contrast, sorry.
Can I ask a question about that? Because it would, to me, it seems like it would need a beginning, because you would still need a first parent to start the chain off. So what am I missing?
Why would you need a first parent to start the chain off?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like, if you're going to have this series, somebody had to have started it.
Why?
Because if it didn't have a beginning, it wouldn't have it wouldn't be there to begin with. You wouldn't have it at all.
Well, I mean, does that not just presuppose that there has to be a beginning? Why couldn't it just be infinite and always be?
Well, I mean, because, okay, you mentioned there Peter is not the cause of John, he's the cause of James, and James is the cause of John. But in a sense, Peter is a cause of his grandson John, indirectly, because he had James and James had John. So I'm wanting to find something that started this series out. You're saying that there wouldn't have to be something necessary, but I think that there would, but I might be missing it.
Yeah, well,
Right,
maybe go ahead, Gavin.
If I could just address that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Peter is the cause of James with respect to paternity. That's why I stress the causality of the series is paternity. Mm-hmm. He's not the cause of John with respect to paternity, because he's not the father of John.
Sure. Right.
So given that, as long as you always have an immediately succeeding member, there's no need for any first member.
Right. With respect of paternity, but
right,
exactly. But then there's other causes involved here,
and that's what I was going to bring up. Right, we have to. What is the causal property under consideration? Right,
okay.
we have to remember what the causal property under consideration is here, because in a causal series, say have X, Y, Z. X, Y, Z is a causal series, right? It's essentially ordered when the causal property into consideration, where Y would have to borrow from X that causal power to produce Z. Right, that would be an essentially ordered. Whereas in an accidentally ordered series, you don't have this borrowing or derivativeness going on.
I see what you're saying.
So if we're just considering the causal property under consideration, we can answer that with just in the paternity one with just whoever that immediate father was. Okay. You say right, but I want to just say, Michael, I'm actually with you in general that I've gradually adopted a position of just sort of a restricted anti-infinitist position. I actually don't think that any causal series at this point, any causal series actually could, where there could be, let me say it this way. I don't think that there's sense to be made where any one effect can be preceded by an infinite number of causes. But I'm willing to put that aside because that's much dispute among Thomists, right? So I'll just say I'm personally persuaded of this restricted anti-infinitist position, but we don't need that. We don't need that commitment, because the distinctions between these series will show that at least a certain type of causal series absolutely cannot proceed to infinity. But I think you brought up a good point of clarification, because we have to keep in mind, well, what is the causal property under consideration to draw these distinctions and clarifications?
Okay. Again, sorry to derail. I'm just making sure I'm following.
No, it's these good, this is really good stuff, because it's these subtleties that are so important that if they go overlooked, I mean, it can just cause somebody to totally miss the argument entirely. Yeah. So I'm really glad that you're pressing and bringing this stuff up.
So I mean that brings up that brings us to the per se ordered series, as distinct from the per accidens ordered series, because as Pat pointed out, in the per se ordered series, the members of the series don't have the causal power in virtue of what they are. So whereas fathers and sons have the causality of the series in virtue of being biologically functioning males. So as long as you have a biologically functioning male in the series, you have the series. In a per se series, it's the exact opposite. The members of the series don't have the causality of the series in themselves in virtue of what they are, and so they depend on something for that causality. So the example Thomas gives is that the mind or mental agent moves a hand to move the stick to move the stone. The hand, stick, and stone in themselves as hands, sticks, and stones are motionless. They need something, or they depend on something for their motion. They participate in some sort of cause of motion. And the cause of motion, say, in this example, the mental agent is just something which is able to bring about motion in virtue of what it is. That's something that mental agents can do. They can, bring about motion without being caused themselves to bring about motion. Another example is a fire heating a pot to heat the contents of the pot. The pot and the contents are not heated in themselves. They're not self-heating, so they're put next to a source of heat in order that they may be heated. Fire, just in virtue of what it is, heats. That's one of the things that fire does. It heats essentially. It's an uncaused source of heat because given its nature, it just heats. It doesn't depend on anything else to draw its heat from. It heats in virtue of what it is. And that's a feature of these per se ordered series. But notice something there. If you take away the primary cause in no series, the causal series just collapses. So if you take away the mental agent, the hand, the stick, and the stone remain immobile. They don't have the causality of the series if you take away the primary cause. So the primary cause is essential in per se ordered series. Otherwise, the members of the series don't have the causal actuality of the series in question. Without the primary cause, then, there is no causal actuality within the series. Hand, stick, and stone remain immobile. The question then is, which sort of causal series, then, is existence found in as a causal property? Okay, which we've already seen that existence is a causal property. Things are dependent for their existence on an extrinsic principle. So which sort of series is it? It can't be the accidentally ordered series, like the fathers and sons, because in that sort of series, the members of the series have the causality of the series in virtue of what they are. We've just seen that essence and existence are distinct, and that existence is not possessed by members of the series as a result of their intrinsic nature. So existence is a causal property locatable within a per se ordered series. But if that is the case, then like the mind, hand, stick, stone example, if there were no primary cause of existence, things wouldn't have the causal actuality of existence. Okay, so if there were no primary cause, things simply wouldn't exist. Now, a primary cause in per se ordered series is something that has the causality of the series in itself, i.e. something that doesn't have the causality of the series as distinct from itself and thereby in a dependent fashion, but rather has it in virtue of what it is, such as a mental agent being able to originate motion or fire heating in virtue of what it is. So in this example, with regard to existence then, unless we have a primary cause of existence, there would be nothing. A primary cause of existence must be something which doesn't have existence in a distinct sort of manner, distinct from itself, in which it participates, but in virtue of what it is able to originate existence. And that's something in which essence and existence are identical, which per the previous stage we've seen is one, unique, and immaterial. And if God has been understood to be anything, God has been understood to be a single, unique, immaterial source of existence for all else. And that's the argument for God in the day Ente, written by Thomas in his early 30s. While he was still a PhD student.
Yeah. So what am I doing with my life? Is what you're trying to say.
Right. Do you think that this is the best argument, best proof for God's existence?
I certainly do.
Yeah, no, I do. Like I say, I play around with contemporary formulations, but I always admit, and I just did if anybody wants to check it out, like to see the way I play around with this, I just did a YouTube, like a hour-and-a-half YouTube presentation on that. But I make very clear from the start that I really don't think I'm doing anything new at all. Like I am just pulling from Aquinas's De Ente reasoning on this, because I do think that it's just so powerful, right? And it provides such a beautiful account of reality and explanation. And I actually love the way that Father Norris Clark puts it. And he's Father Norris Clark is somebody who plays around with contemporary formulations too, but it's clearly just drawing upon these traditional insights, right? Is that once you have this sort of, you think of like reality, in total and how to make sense of the one and the many, and you have all this multiplicity of things, and you start with a kind of a simple hypothesis, like, okay, maybe there's like this baseline level of existence, and you sort of add things on top of it, right? And that explains multiplicity. And Clark's like, no, that can't work, because outside of existence, there's nothing. So there's nothing to add, right? So like existence can't be a minimum. So Clark says it actually has to be the opposite, right? Existence has to be the maximum. And then anything else that exists has to just be a set of minuses. It has to be a set of subtractions, right? It's God kind of thinking up the world and saying, okay, this can exist, and it's going to be like me, but it's going to be existence in a horsey mode, or this can exist and it's going to be like me and it's going to be existence in an electron mode, or this exists and it's like me in this particular way because it exists in a Michael Lofton mode, right? And it gives you just this beautiful metaphysical and explanatorily adequate account of reality. So not only do I think is the argument sound, does it actually work when you roll up your sleeves and do the metaphysics and work through the objections, which of course always takes time. But it just, to me, like, it's the best explanation on offer, right? In terms of just making sense of the world that we live in. It's a beautiful one too, right? Because we get, once pure actuality is on the table, we get the whole suite of divine attributes, including, God is supremely good, which is like, that's great news, right? As God is unconditionally loving, because as Gaven writes in his book, right? God grants existence, which is the fundamental and most primary good, to everything else that exists without them having merited it, because nobody existed before they got existence, so they couldn't have done anything to earn that, right? So we see that whatever else the foundation of reality is, whatever else that transcendent anchor point is, which everything else hangs, it's as good as it gets. And like, not only do you get a beautiful metaphysical explanation of reality, but it's great news. It's awesome. And like, all else things equal, like if you got something that's so explanatory powerful and it's good news, like, you should be attracted to it. Like that, like you should. Sometimes people object, like, oh, you just want that to be true. Well, of course I want it to be true. You think I want nihilism to be true? Like, that's terrible, right? I used to be an atheist. Like, that's not a good worldview to live in, right? Not a lot of happy outlooks there, right? But regardless of feelings, I think it is true. So yeah, I think this is, and I think Gaven would probably agree that this is also just like, this just is Thomas's argument, and that whatever other formulations he give, we should see the De Ente as sort of being the decoder ring to understand or interpret his other ways to God. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And everybody send some chat questions. Make sure to put it to @Reason and Theology so I can pick it out from the comments. And then one of the questions that I have is, okay, so do you think that the average Catholic can just pick up this work by Aquinas and understand it? Or would we pick it up and just be lost?
Yeah, maybe if I could come in on that. Well, it depends on the average Catholic, but no. I mean, this is high level, intense sort of metaphysics. We're kind of just bouncing it out here, but when you actually have to read it, and you see how regimented the reasoning is, it's really sort of high level stuff. And I mean, I get asked this all the time, when I teach this to students, and I teach, maybe you get some religious groups that are interested in doing some theology, and I teach this, and immediately they react, and say, well, not everybody's going to understand this. And it's like, well, yeah, good. It's specialized stuff. Why would you think everybody would understand it? And immediately the kickback was like, well, don't you want everybody to believe in God? But this philosophy isn't for everyone. I mean, all we're pointing out is that there's an objective, systematic way of, demonstrating God's existence. And so for those who are of that mindset, well, there you go. But if you're not of that mindset, if you're somebody who has a different way of sort of knowing that God exists, maybe, you've had an experience of God, or maybe you've had some sort of experiences in your life which convince you of God. Well, good for you. Right. That's great. But, this is for people who are philosophers. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be all univocal. Thomas was a big fan of analogy and analogical thinking. I mean, human beings are diverse, and there's diverse ways in which they can, come to affirm God. But this is for philosophers, and I think it's important that we do have that. That we don't have, a Catholicism by, basic common denominator, or a highest common factor, as it were, that everybody should sign up to. That's the creed. That's the Articles of Faith. Then the philosophy and all the rest, that gets us to God, that's for people who are specialized in different ways. Some people might be into spiritual wellness and stuff like that. Well, I'm into philosophy, and I'm not into spiritual wellness and wholeness and all that sort of stuff. I'm into philosophy. Give me that, and I'll focus on that, and you do your spiritual well-being, and we'll both agree on the Articles of the Creed.
Yeah. I'll just echo what Gaven said. I mean, when you really roll up your sleeves, this is tough stuff. And for me personally, coming from sort of a skeptical background, even when I first encountered this stuff, I didn't understand it. And it was a gradual process, a gradual process of seriously engaging with it and working through the various objections. And, maybe we could consider some of those. We obviously haven't considered all objections. You have your classic like Humean objections and stuff like that, and charges of composition fallacy and stuff like that. So, you got to not just try and understand the metaphysics, but then you take the time to kind of work through some of the more technical puzzles. I think they can all be overcome. So even if you are kind of serious about this, it's still not going to be easy, right? So that's not to discourage anybody. I think that this type of study is extremely fruitful and can be edifying in many ways. But I would say approach it with a posture of patience, to be sure. Mm-hmm.
Even Aquinas, to my recollection, notes that, okay, it's possible to know God by reason, but most people don't have the time and things like that to actually go through all the proofs. So supernatural revelation suffices for them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, it reminds me of what you were saying there earlier, Dr. Gaven.
Yeah.
Let me take a stab at this real quick before I ask one of the chat questions, and tell me if I'm completely off. But is this an example about how we can tell the distinction between essence and existence? If we look at the Mario painting there, we all know the essence of Mario. We all have that in our mind, but we know he doesn't exist. Therefore, there's an actual legitimate distinction between the two. Is that a good example, or did I just completely butcher it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to consider there. Like, one is that like Mario has a sort of a to be thought about, right? So there's that, and we can talk about the difference between real being and intentional being. But he hasn't popped out of my imagination into reality yet. So we can use that to like buffer certain causal principles, right? The things just don't like typically pop out of imaginations in reality. But I mean, the one thing we didn't talk about of like one of the most obvious things that point to the real distinction just is the natural and obvious contingency of things in the world. They come into existence, they pass out of existence. So even this painting, like, I mean, maybe it's always existed, but I think somebody created it, right? So there's a time when it didn't exist. Now you might go, well, that's not a substance, that's an artifact, but fine. We could say, well, whatever the parts of that are, whatever the substances involved in that are, right, presumably are also contingent, right? So just the sheer contingency of anything, yourself, right? Pretty sure I didn't always exist, right? I'm pretty confident that there was a time when I sort of entered into reality, when reality decided to include me. But there's nothing about Pat Flynn that demands reality includes me, right? And the fact that there's nothing about Pat Flynn that demands that reality includes me shows that there's something that's not essential about me, right? That I sort of borrow existence. I derive it from somewhere, not just from mom and dad who helped bring me into being, but I'm contingent at all times upon Earth's atmosphere, electromagnetism, right? Like the operations and structures of cells, molecules. Like, so some conditions extrinsic to me help explain what like helped me come into reality in the first place. Other conditions explain why I'm still here, right? So if you look at the painting or me, just the sheer contingency of things itself points to or suggests the real distinction. But then the real distinction also explains why things are contingent, right? Like sometimes you have these general arguments for contingency, but you want kind of like a deeper metaphysical reason of why are things contingent in the first place. And Aquinas has an answer for that, because they are metaphysically composite, right? Because they don't have, they don't own existence, right? They aren't identical with their active existence. They receive it. So,
and one other quick question: when we talk about things like that they don't exist in reality, like Mario, we have this concept of this figure in our mind, but we know they don't exist in reality. Could we speak of this concept as existing? Is there existence to concepts and ideas?
There's intentional being, right? So I'll let Gaven take that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Thomas refers to such things as entia rationis, beings of reason. So they only have mental existence. They don't have real existence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're contingent upon minds, right? So that's the thing, right? Like Mario, my thinking about Mario is contingent upon the concrete reality of my thinking, right?
But they're all in God's mind, ultimately, even before our minds.
Yeah. I mean, God, in understanding his divine essence, understands everything open to his power. and so he understands every possibility of being. To say that they're in God's mind is a little sort of off. What it's to say is that they're all understood by God, but not that in God's mind there are all these concepts.
Because, and why would you want to guard against that? Just curious.
Because I would say that God understands simply by means of the divine essence, and the divine essence is simple. So whereas we have different conceptual contents by which we understand things, the conceptual content by which God understands things is the divine essence itself. So it's a bit like... So,
he knows every way in which he could be participated, I guess.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So God knows one thing. He knows himself. And embedded in that, we would say, is a knowledge of all the ways that things could participate.
It just kind of almost seems like that's not then very personal. He doesn't know me personally. How would you guard against that? I'm sorry to derail things here, but how would you guard against the idea that when you say that, when he knows himself, then he doesn't know me personally. He just knows that I participate in him or something like that.
Because you participate in him, because he has willed that you participate in him. So it's precisely because you're a result of his wanting you to exist, that you exist. So you would not exist unless, out of the love that he has for himself, he, loves you and thus brings you into existence.
But then he also doesn't will some of these other ideas like Mario. He doesn't will Mario to exist. So it seems like there's a difference in his will there. He wills for me to exist, but he doesn't will for Mario.
Right. But that difference is extrinsic to God. That's the key. Yeah. Okay. Right. So
we actually addressed that the last day,
that was the last conversation.
Intentional agency and how, the Anscomian, as opposed to Davidsonian approach to that, can sort that out.
But hey, let's not rule out that there might be another universe out there where Mario actually is instantiated.
Where Mario exists.
I mean, I don't want to rule that out completely yet. A little skeptical, but
here's how I know that there's not at least an infinite amount of parallel universes. You know how I know? Well, if there were an infinite amount of other parallel universes, somewhere in this infinite, series of universes or whatever, there would be one of them where they figured out a way to communicate to all the other universes that there are other parallel universes, and they would be able to immediately infuse that knowledge directly to every being in those universes. Right. And that has never happened, so there can't be an infinite amount of them.
You've got a whole bunch of philosophical problems with these types of proposals, which is why they've become like more restricted over time, and then you have to like put in more arbitrary constraints and stuff like that. But I think it is important to understand that the arguments that we've given, the sort of general Thomistic cosmological reasoning, is like, you could say, okay, yeah, maybe there are multiverses or stuff like that. Wouldn't affect the argument, right? It's just because they would still be contingent realities of things that don't, have existence in a built-in way, essences. So we can be completely neutral on those debates, but I'm with you. No, I'm quite skeptical of various multiverses.
There could be maybe another universe where there isn't a fall, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, I guess, or aliens, right, that may have fallen, maybe haven't. I don't think about that stuff all too often, but it's interesting. Certainly, like it still remains an open possibility in my mind.
Sure. Yeah, I'm with you. This one is from Joel. If there's a Q&A later, what would Gaven and Pat say about the possibility of existential inertia in the essence of certain contingent objects? Graham Opie and Joe Schmidt assume this.
Right. So Gaven and I answer this in different ways. So Gaven, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I've got two papers forthcoming on the issue. So I've got a paper just on existential inertia itself, and that's forthcoming with Divinitas. So it's the 2019 edition of Divinitas. They're a couple of years behind with the publications. So I just received the 2018 one, so the 2019 one should be coming out soon. And that's just on existential inertia itself. That appeared, the final manuscript of that was off and away before Schmidt wrote his paper on existential inertia. So I have another paper forthcoming in Nova et Vetera on Aquinas' first way, where I address Schmidt's position. But the basic position, the fundamental position, is that existential inertia on a Thomist metaphysics of essence and essay doesn't make any sense, and this is why. When we take the typical properties, which are given in examples of inertia, such as color properties or whatever, they presuppose some subsisting subject in which they subsist. So there is something in which they subsist, and they remain in the subject until something comes and knocks them out of the subject. That's the inertial hypothesis, that, things maintain their reality, not as a result of some cause acting on the thing, but as a result of some cause not acting on the thing, such that once that cause comes and changes the reality, that's whenever, they lose whatever property it is, let's say the color property or whatever. And then Schmidt's paper, gives, different frameworks within which that could be understood. But what I argue is that on the metaphysics of essence and existence, existence is not a property which could be inertial, because existence doesn't presuppose a prior subject within which to subsist. Rather, existence is that without which there would be no subject. So the thing is that the subject subsists because it has existence, and so any inertial property, then it has to follow existence. Okay, so existence itself can't be inertial precisely because there is no subject in which to exist for the inertial property to remain. All that is to say, then, that unless there were some cause for the existence of the thing in which the thing participated for as long as it had existence, then the thing just simply would not be. So it's not the case that a thing is neutral with regard to existing and non-existing. A thing is precisely nothing unless it has existence granted to it. There is no neutrality between existing and non-existing. A thing just is naturally nothing unless there's a cause on which it depends for its existence. So that's what I argue in the Divinitas paper, and then also I specify the Schmidt's framework in the paper on the first way coming out with Nova et Cetera.
Yeah, and just to be fair to a number of the critics, and existential inertia traces way back. It's kind of funny, in my own kind of intellectual journey, one of the first books I read on natural theology was called How to Think About God by Mortimer Adler, where he actually thinks that existential inertia totally devastates Aquinas's way to God, right? However, he completely overlooks a lot of the stuff that we talk about here, including the distinctions between different types of causal series and stuff like that. So I just think he was just a little kind of sloppy there. But it's interesting because I was introduced to these types of debates with that objection in mind. And then as I studied more and got into the metaphysics, I realized, as Gavin said, there's no room for it. I won't get into my full response here because I actually addressed this in the full video I did on my YouTube channel, which we can link. But I kind of, a quick response, right? I argue two steps, right? That there has to be at least one uncaused or unconditioned reality in the totality of reality. That's step one. Then I argue that whatever that thing is, it's going to have to be a pure active existence existing through itself, which means it will be uniquely unique, not susceptible to differentiating features. Now, since it's one and only one, since only one thing can exist in virtue of itself, right? Nothing else that exists could ever convert into an unconditioned reality, right? So it will always exist in virtue of extrinsic conditions, right? So kind of once conditioned, always dependent. And since there can only be one unconditioned reality, there's just no room in that ontology for anything like existential inertia, depending on how you want to frame it. So I think there's different ways you can come at it to show that, given the traditional Thomistic metaphysics, it's not only superfluous, but it's refuted, right? Now, again, to be fair to the critics, they're kind of targeting certain specific formulations. I think like Ed Azer's formulation. And I don't do my arguments like Ed does, and I know Gavin doesn't. So I just want to say, maybe just to be fair, right? There might be cross discourses here, right? Mm-hmm.
There's one from Andrew here. Does beauty convert with being?
Absolutely not. I've had this argument so many times, just on the transcendentals, and I've actually got a paper forthcoming on the transcendentals, but. No, I don't think beauty is one of those transcendental properties of being, because a transcendental property of being is not only to be found to coincide everywhere being is to be found, but it's to be referentially identical with being. And so arguments are made for the one, the true, and the good to be referentially identical with being and to coincide with being, but the beauty, given the nature of beauty, whilst it may coincide, whilst it may be found everywhere being is found, it's not referentially identical to being, because what's involved with beauty seems to be a cross between the true and the good. So beauty seems to emerge when the true and the good are found together, and that's where beauty comes from. So whilst it's coincident with being, it's not referentially identical, so I don't think it's convertible.
We got time for one more. I would ask more, but I have to pick up the kids from a birthday party. So.
I get that, my friend. Uh-huh.
This one is from Matthew. What is Dr. Kerr's response to Canasis's claim that the real distinction cannot be known until we arrive at esse tantum, and that the argument from the impossibility of multiplication doesn't work isn't necessary because of diversified esse is known already via conceptual distinction through judgmentally grasped esse?
Yeah. So I've read Nasus's book, Cosmological Reasoning, a few times now. And Matthew, I'm just going to have to say that, sometimes Nasus just baffles me. And this is one of the, places where he baffles me. First of all, one of the issues that I have with Nasus's reading is that the proof of God requires the real distinction in order to get going. So essence and existence have to be known to be really distinct in order to set up the proof of esse tantum. So it seems to me that's it's a bit circular to say that the real distinction can only be known after esse tantum has been established, when the real distinction is a premise in the argument for esse tantum. If conceptual distinction is, if Canassis is to argue along with Owens that conceptual distinction suffices to get that argument off the ground, I don't think that works, because two realities they can be conceptually distinct but really identical, and if they're really identical, the causal reasoning for esse tantum won't get off the ground. Now, with regard to what you're saying here, that multiplication doesn't work, it's not necessary because diversified esse is known already via conceptual distinction through judgmentally grasped esse. This is just a place where I disagree with Canassis, because I think he's bringing in a phenomenological epistemology in the reading of the argument in the De Ente, which just isn't there. It's just not to be found in Aquinas. And so I think, Aquinas is just being a plain old epistemic realist in the argument from the De Ente, and he's just pointing out, he's not analyzing, judgment and the structure of judgment and how the structure of judgment correlates with the various metaphysical components of reality. He's looking at the metaphysical components of reality themselves, especially in that, impossibility of multiplication argument, and affirming, that if it's a conceptual truth that there could be no more than one being whose essence is its existence, then anything which is not unique and multiple is not that being. And so I would need to see more justification from Nasus why we wouldn't read the De Ente that way, and why we would read it in the highly sophisticated phenomenological epistemology that he uses in cosmological reasoning. So, that's how I would respond to him. Look, Canassis and I have kind of been back and forth a few times on that. He's coming to Ireland next year, so no doubt after a few drinks and a few tattoos, we'll have the argument again.
Maybe an old French duel if it comes to that.
Oh yeah, or a kung fu cage fight.
By the way,
sometimes the old ways are the best ways.
Yeah. By the way, I saw this one. Do they have YouTube channels that they could give shout outs for? Put in plugs for anything y'all want.
Yeah. Well, Gavin's on my channel a lot, actually. So it's just, if you just Google the Pat Flynn Show, and I'll just, maybe Michael, I can just give you a link to just put in the show notes or something. Yeah, cool. Yeah, and my website, chroniclesofstrength.com, my podcast, the Pat Flynn Show. Those are all my different platforms, and Gavin has graciously been a guest many times. So if you enjoyed this type of discussion, we've got, I don't know, Gavin, we might be up to like 20 hours of content, I feel like.
Yeah, good bit. We've been going for about a year and a half, averaging about twice a month, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Do you have anything else you want to add, Dr. Gavin?
Just that, we just had a big philosophy conference there on Thursday at St. Patrick's, Maynooth. So we had John Betts speaking, we had Jennifer Martin speaking, we had Lorella Conjuncti, Tim Paul, all speaking on the future of Christian metaphysics with responses from people. So the raw footage of that is with our marketing people. So, each of those lectures and responses are going to be up on YouTube at some point. So just keep an eye out on my Facebook page or, on the St. Patrick's College website for that. We also had a Vatican I conference the week before. Theology put it on, where each of us gave papers on, each of the chapters of De Filius. So I gave a paper on the chapter on faith, and, several others, gave papers on different issues, and the raw footage of that's being edited at the minute, and it should be getting online. And then we've got our big conference next year in 2022 at St. Patrick's. So we've got Rowan Williams, Eleanor Stump, David Bentley Hart, John Canassis, Julia Klima, Robert George, Patrick Lee, lots and lots of big names coming over and speaking on campus. So please do check that out, get signed up, and come along to Ireland. We want to get Pat to get his first tattoo when he's over in Ireland. So he has to get a tattoo now that's been mentioned.
Yeah. Whatever is reduced from potency to act must be so actualized by something already in act. How's that for
for the tattoo? If you get it in Latin, it might pass.
Absolutely,
be a good conversation starter.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I thank y'all so much for coming on. I'd love to have y'all on again for whatever topic y'all want to do.
Michael, it's a pleasure. You're doing great work, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, and we'd love to do it again.
All right, we'll talk off the air about some dates and possibility for topics. So again, I appreciate y'all coming on so much. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for your time and for these efforts. And of course, everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to, of course, comment, like, and subscribe. Share this on your social media. Check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us. Till next time, God bless.